He was an old man the world had forgotten, counting the last hours of his life behind prison walls. His only wish before execution was to see his dog one last time. When the German Shepherd walked into the prison yard, the world seemed to stop. The old man knelt down, tears falling, and the dog ran into his arms, trembling with love and memory. But then, the dog froze and began to growl at one of the guards. That growl uncovered a secret buried for 7 years, a lie that sent an innocent man to death row. What followed would stop an execution, expose the guilty, and prove that God's miracles still walk among us, sometimes on 4 legs, wearing loyalty in their eyes. The winter wind swept through the outskirts of Denver, Colorado, carrying with it a bitter cold that seemed to whisper of forgotten regrets. Inside the Rockvale Federal Penitentiary, the walls groaned with age and memory. Frost clung to the bars. The floors smelled faintly of bleach and despair. Beyond the heavy steel door of cell 42, Samuel Carter sat on the edge of his narrow cot, staring at the floor as if it held the map of his whole life. Samuel was 60 years old, his once broad shoulders now slightly stooped from years of confinement. His hair, once chestnut brown, had turned a soft gray that framed his face like worn silver. His beard, trimmed short but uneven, was peppered with white, and his hands, calloused, scarred from decades as a mechanic, trembled only when the wind howled through the ventilation shaft. In his youth, Samuel had been a builder of engines and a restorer of old motorcycles. He loved the sound of metal, the rhythm of precision. But life had broken him in quieter ways, through loneliness, loss, and the cruel misunderstanding that had led him here. He had been convicted of a crime he didn't commit, the murder of his neighbor during a home robbery gone wrong. The evidence had pointed to him. A bloody wrench from his workshop, fingerprints on the doorknob, the wrong place at the wrong time. No one believed his story, and no one fought for him once the headlines moved on. For 7 years, Samuel had lived inside this small gray box, learning to speak less and listen more. Time had carved away his anger, leaving only a strange calmness, the kind that sometimes comes when a man has nothing left to fear. On this morning, the air was unusually still. The guards spoke in whispers, their boots echoing across the corridor like drums for a funeral march. The warden, Henry Wallace, a tall man in his 50s with thinning blonde hair and tired blue eyes, stood by the observation window, watching Samuel in silence. Wallace had served in the system for over 2 decades, long enough to know that death row inmates each carried a story heavier than their sentence. He was fair but weary, the kind of man whose compassion had been eroded by policy. When he entered Samuel's cell, his voice carried both duty and unease. "Carter," he said quietly, "it's time to record your final request." Samuel looked up, his eyes a pale, watery gray that still somehow held the gentleness of someone who once fixed bicycles for neighborhood kids. "I don't need a meal," he murmured. "No visitors either." Wallace waited, pen hovering over the clipboard. "Then what is it you want?" Samuel's lips twitched into something between a smile and a memory. "I'd like to see my dog, Ranger." There was a pause. Even the hum of the fluorescent light seemed to hesitate. The request was unheard of. A condemned man asking not for food or family, but for a dog. Wallace blinked. "Your dog?" Samuel nodded slowly. "He was taken when they arrested me. He's probably old now, if he's even still alive. But I'd like to see him once more, if that's allowed." Wallace didn't answer immediately. He knew the regulations, no outside animals, no exceptions. Yet there was something in Samuel's voice, something stripped of pretense or pleading. just a quiet truth. "I'll see what I can do," Wallace said at last, closing the folder. His voice betrayed a flicker of compassion that prison walls rarely permitted. When he left, the sound of the heavy door locking again echoed like a verdict. Samuel leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. The memories came easily now. Ranger, a German shepherd with a black saddle and amber eyes sharp as mountain fire. He had been with Samuel since he was a pup, found half frozen near a gas station on a December night 12 years ago. The dog had been all ribs and shivers then, but loyal from the first touch. Samuel had nursed him back to health, named him after the Colorado Rangers who once patrolled the mountains, and they had been inseparable ever since. Even after Samuel's wife, Margaret, passed away from illness, Ranger had kept him from collapsing into the dark. The dog's steady presence, the soft weight of its head on his knee, the sound of breathing beside his bed, had been the only constant warmth in a house that had grown too quiet. When the police stormed in that night, lights flashing, Ranger had barked wildly, trying to defend his master. They had tranquilized him, taken him away. That was the last time Samuel heard his voice. Now, in the sterile air of the cell, Samuel's chest tightened. He wondered if Ranger would recognize him after all these years, or if he'd forgotten, replaced by another home, another human. The thought hurt more than death itself. He whispered to the silence, "You were the best part of me, boy. You kept me human." That afternoon, word of his request spread through the facility. Some guards scoffed, others pitied. One of them, Officer Ramirez, a young man in his 30s with dark hair and a soft-spoken manner, lingered outside Samuel's cell after his shift. "I heard about your dog," he said, voice low. "That's unusual." Samuel smiled faintly. "So am I." Ramirez hesitated, his fingers tightening on his keyring. "My dad used to say dogs know truth better than judges. Maybe he was right." He gave a small nod and walked away. Hours later, Warden Wallace stood in his office, the snow swirling beyond the barred window. A stack of files lay open before him, Samuel's record, spotless. No violence, no trouble, just quiet obedience. There was even a photo attached, a younger Samuel kneeling beside a proud German shepherd. Wallace exhaled deeply and made the call. "Contact Animal Control. See if there's still a dog registered under Samuel Carter's name. If it's alive, bring it in tomorrow morning. I'll take responsibility." The next morning, dawn broke pale and cold over the prison yard. Samuel was escorted outside, his wrists cuffed loosely, breath fogging in the icy air. He stood beneath the gray sky, snowflakes catching in his beard. Beyond the chain-link fence, a van approached. His heart began to hammer with the fragile rhythm of hope, a feeling he thought had died long ago. And when the door opened and Ranger stepped out, tail stiff, eyes scanning the yard, Samuel forgot the years, the walls, the sentence. For the first time in 7 winters, he smiled. Snow still drifted lazily over the Denver skyline when Samuel Carter stepped into the prison yard once more, his breath curling like smoke in the morning air. The gray light of dawn spilled through the razor wire, painting long shadows across the cracked concrete. He wore a faded beige jumpsuit, his shackles clinking softly with each step. At 60, he moved slower than he once had, but his eyes, those weathered, thoughtful eyes, seemed suddenly alive again. Ahead, a van idled near the far gate, steam rising from its exhaust. Inside, he knew, was the only soul who had never judged him, Ranger. When the rear doors opened, Ranger emerged, older now, his once dark muzzle grayed with time, his fur a blend of black and tan dulled by age. Yet his gait was steady, proud. He had the broad chest and intelligent gaze of a purebred German shepherd, though his right ear bent slightly at the tip from an old injury. The moment his amber eyes found Samuel, the leash strained taut. Then, with a bark that broke the stillness, Ranger lunged forward. The leash slackened, and Samuel knelt, arms open. The dog collided with his chest, paws pressed to his shoulders, whining and nuzzling beneath his chin. Samuel's rough hands buried themselves in the thick fur. He could smell earth, winter, and the faint trace of oil and leather. Memories of home, of his old garage, of better days. Tears stung his eyes, and for a heartbeat the world was silent, but for the rhythm of two hearts remembering. Around them, a handful of officers watched. Among them was Sergeant Douglas Miller, a tall, square-jawed man in his 40s. His hair was cut military short, the color of gunmetal, and his clean-shaven face carried the kind of hardness that comes from authority untempered by empathy. Miller had served overseas before joining the prison system. Rumor said he had lost a friend in Afghanistan and had never quite returned whole. His tone was always clipped, efficient, never warm. He watched the reunion with an expression Samuel couldn't read, neither disdain nor pity, but a strange, fixed stare. Beside him stood Officer Ramirez, his posture tense, eyes glancing between Miller and the old man. There was something different in the air, an unease that rippled just beneath the quiet. Ranger's tail, which had been wagging moments ago, suddenly stilled. His ears pricked forward, body rigid. A low growl began in his chest, deep and primal, rolling through the yard like distant thunder. Miller frowned. "Control your dog," he barked. Samuel looked down, startled. "Ranger, easy boy. It's all right." But it wasn't. The growl deepened. The dog's amber eyes locked on Miller's face. The fur along his spine bristled. Samuel knew that look. Ranger was not an aggressive dog by nature. Years of companionship had taught him patience, loyalty, restraint. But he also knew truth better than any man. And now, that truth trembled at the surface of a beast's throat. The warden, Henry Wallace, emerged from the observation balcony above, his long coat snapping in the wind. "What's going on down there?" Ramirez looked up. "Sir, I don't know." The dog reacted to Sergeant Miller. Miller turned sharply. "It's an animal. He's reacting to the tension. That's all." Samuel, still crouched, met the warden's gaze. "He's never growled like that before. Not without reason." The yard fell silent again, except for the faint whine of the wind. Wallace's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd seen enough of men to know when instincts were worth listening to. "All right," he said slowly. "That's enough for today. Take Carter back inside, and get that dog checked for stress." As the guards began to escort Samuel back toward the cell block, he glanced over his shoulder. Miller was standing perfectly still, arms crossed, his face unreadable. But Ranger, even as he was led away, kept looking back, ears flat, teeth bared in a silent warning that only the guilty could fear. Hours later, Samuel sat in his cell, unable to shake the image. The prison was quiet now, the snow outside deepening into a muffled white silence. He replayed it in his mind. The tension in Ranger's muscles, the guttural sound that had come from deep inside him. That dog had saved him from a falling beam once, barked at gas leaks, sensed when storms were coming long before thunder rolled. Ranger was never wrong. A faint knock came at the door. Officer Ramirez slipped inside, his voice low. "Carter, you said that dog of yours doesn't growl for no reason, right?" Samuel looked up, wary. That's right. Ramirez nodded, his expression troubled. I did some checking. Sergeant Miller, he was listed as one of the responding officers the night of your arrest. But here's the thing. There's no official record of him on the report. His name's missing. Samuel frowned, his pulse quickening. Why would that be? Beats me, Ramirez said, glancing toward the hallway before lowering his voice further. But if your dog recognized him, maybe there's more to that night than anyone wanted to admit. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something stirring beneath the numbness that prison had built into him. Hope, cautious but alive. Can you find anything else? Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. I'll try, quietly. When he left, Samuel sat back on the cot, his mind racing. He wasn't a man of wild theories, but he trusted what life had taught him. Machines don't lie, and neither do dogs. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the razor wire in deceptive peace. Ranger slept in a kennel nearby, restless even in dreams. The old man closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness. You saw something, didn't you, boy? The next morning, when the guards escorted him past the kennels, Ranger barked sharply, not once but 3 times, toward a group of officers by the eastern gate. Miller was among them. His expression darkened as their eyes met, and Samuel realized it then. Fear, not annoyance, flickered behind that cold stare. And in that instant, Samuel knew the truth was closer than anyone dared to believe. The snow outside had hardened into icy sheets that clung to the razor wire, glinting under the floodlights. Inside Rockvale Penitentiary, silence stretched long and brittle. Samuel Carter lay awake on his cot, the faint hum of the radiator keeping rhythm with the restless thoughts circling in his mind. He could still see Ranger's tense stance, could still hear the low growl aimed at Sergeant Miller. There was something buried in that sound, a memory that refused to die. When morning came, Officer Ramirez appeared again, his face drawn and cautious. He carried a thin folder under his arm, the edges smudged with fingerprints. Ramirez was in his early 30s, with dark olive skin and tired eyes that revealed too many night shifts and too much quiet empathy. He closed the cell door behind him, lowering his voice. I shouldn't even have this, he began, sliding the folder onto Samuel's cot. But I checked the archives. Inside were photocopies, old reports, grainy photographs, a property log. One image made Samuel's breath catch. His own garage, half lit by a police flashlight, the chalk outline of his neighbor's body near the workbench. Ramirez pointed to a signature at the bottom of the initial evidence report. That's Miller's handwriting. He logged your wrench as the murder weapon that night. But look here. His name was later crossed out and replaced. Samuel leaned closer, the smell of paper and ink mixing with the metallic chill of the cell. Replaced by who? Detective Sarah Holden, Ramirez said. Lead investigator at the time. She's retired now, lives somewhere near Boulder. I found her contact through a friend in records. If she confirms Miller was there, this whole case could open again. Samuel rubbed his temples. Sarah Holden, he remembered the name. She had been in her late 40s back then, a tall woman with streaks of silver already weaving through her chestnut hair. Sharp blue eyes, a reputation for being relentless but fair. She had questioned him for hours the night of his arrest, never raising her voice but never softening either. She believed in evidence, he murmured, not in stories. Ramirez nodded. Then maybe she'll believe in the wrong one. Later that day, Warden Wallace called both men into his office. The warden's workspace was neat, lined with rows of case binders and the faint smell of coffee gone cold. Wallace adjusted his glasses and looked at Ramirez. "You went through sealed files, officer. That's a violation of protocol." "Yes, sir," Ramirez said without hesitation, his voice firm but calm. "But if those files were altered, then we've been enforcing a false sentence for 7 years." The warden's gaze drifted to Samuel. "You understand, Carter, this could cause a storm. If we reopen this, we challenge the integrity of the entire department." Samuel met his eyes steadily. "Sir, with all respect, my integrity was taken a long time ago. I just want the truth back." For a long moment, Wallace said nothing. Then he exhaled through his nose, weary but resolved. "All right. Ramirez, arrange a meeting with this retired detective. I'll authorize a supervised call, but keep Miller out of it for now." Outside, in the cold courtyard, Miller watched from a distance, his posture rigid. His jaw twitched slightly as he saw the warden and Ramirez leave the office together. He had the kind of eyes that never rested, gray, sharp, always calculating. When a guard named Tom Hensley, a burly man with freckles and a nervous laugh, passed by, Miller spoke quietly. "Keep an eye on Carter and the officer he's been talking to. I don't like coincidences." That night, Ramirez drove to Boulder in an old prison sedan, its headlights cutting through the curtain of falling snow. The address led him to a modest cabin surrounded by pine trees, smoke curling from a stone chimney. He knocked, and after a pause, the door opened to reveal Sarah Holden, now in her mid-50s. She was tall, still striking in her presence. Her once dark hair had turned fully silver, tied back in a loose bun. Her eyes, pale blue and piercing, regarded him with quiet curiosity. "Detective Holden?" Ramirez asked. "I'm Officer Ramirez from Rockvale Penitentiary. It's about the Carter case." Her expression flickered, surprise then something like regret. "I haven't heard that name in years. Come in." Inside, the cabin was warm and orderly. Books lined the walls, true crime, psychology, law. A small oil lamp flickered beside a framed photograph of a younger Sarah standing beside 2 men in uniform, one of them unmistakably Sergeant Miller. Ramirez noticed it immediately. "We found discrepancies in the reports," he said, handing her the folder. Miller's signature was removed from the arrest log. Sarah adjusted her glasses, scanning the pages. Her face hardened as she read. "I didn't remove his name. In fact, I remember questioning why he was there at all that night. He wasn't assigned to that sector. When I asked, he said he was just passing through." She closed the folder slowly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But I remember something else. He was nervous. And he kept insisting the wrench was the weapon before forensics even tested it." Ramirez leaned forward. "Could you testify to that?" She hesitated. "If I do, I'll be accusing a man I once trusted. But—" Her eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantel. "Maybe it's time someone did." Back at the prison, Samuel sat in the dark cell, waiting. The walls seemed closer now, the air heavier. Ranger stirred in the kennel down the hall, his ears twitching as if sensing the tension. When the phone rang in the warden's office that night, Wallace picked up, listening silently. After a long pause, he said only, "Thank you, Detective. That's all I needed to know." The next morning, Miller arrived at the yard, his breath visible in the cold. As he passed Ranger's cage, the dog stood, tail stiff, eyes glowing in the weak dawn light. The low, guttural growl returned. Miller stopped, glaring down. "You're just a dog," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching in the snow. Inside, the warden summoned Samuel. His tone was cautious but different now, less official, more human. "Mr. Carter, the execution's been postponed. We're reopening your case." Samuel's knees weakened slightly. For the first time in years, he felt air fill his lungs without pain. "So, it's not over?" Wallace nodded. "Not yet, but it may end differently this time." In his heart, Samuel already knew the truth had begun to stir. And somewhere beyond the iron bars, in a small cabin near Boulder, an old detective stared out her window, knowing that by speaking up, she had awakened ghosts better left buried. The blizzard hit Denver that night without mercy. Wind clawed at the walls of Rockvale Penitentiary, snow slashing sideways across the floodlights until the whole world seemed to blur into white. Inside, every corridor hummed with quiet tension. Samuel Carter sat awake in his cell, his hands clasped together, listening to the storm howl outside like an old beast remembering its hunger. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that the truth was finally stirring, but truths, he knew, rarely came without a cost. In the warden's office, Henry Wallace stood by the window, the faint light from his desk lamp pooling around stacks of reopened files. His face looked older than it had a week ago, creases deepened by sleepless nights and the burden of morality. He had the bearing of a man who once believed in the system, but had watched too many cracks form in its foundation. Across from him sat Officer Ramirez, his uniform damp from the snow, a tape recorder and notepad laid neatly before him. He was pale with exhaustion, but his brown eyes burned with quiet conviction. "We have Detective Holden's statement on record," Ramirez said. "She's willing to testify that Miller was at the scene and that he tampered with evidence." Wallace nodded slowly, rubbing his temples. "Then we move fast. The Attorney General's office will want a full report before dawn. Miller won't see this coming." But Miller did see something coming. Down in the east corridor, he stood alone by the security monitors, the blue glow casting sharp shadows across his angular features. His jaw was set, his eyes bloodshot from nights of unease. Once he had been a soldier with purpose, disciplined, proud, believing he served justice. But one bad decision, made in panic years ago, had turned him into something hollow. The night Samuel's neighbor died, Miller had been desperate. Debts, bad company, a stolen watch that led him into the wrong house. He'd struck out in fear, not malice, and framed Samuel to survive. And now that ghost had come clawing back through the snow. When the storm reached its peak, alarms blared, power flickered. Guards rushed to secure the east wing as wind tore open part of the outer fencing. Amid the chaos, Miller slipped away from the control room, coat drawn tight, a pistol concealed beneath. His boots crunched on the snow as he made for the kennels. He told himself he needed air, but deep down, he needed to see the dog again, the one that had looked at him as if it already knew everything. Ranger stirred as Miller approached. The German shepherd's fur bristled, his ears flattening. His amber eyes gleamed beneath the dim emergency lights. Miller stopped a few feet from the cage, his breath fogging the cold air. "You should have stayed gone," he muttered, voice hoarse. "You and that old man." Ranger answered with a deep, guttural growl that rolled through the hallway. Miller flinched, gripping his pistol tighter, but he couldn't. Look away. In the beast's eyes, he saw the reflection of the man he'd become. Weak, cornered, afraid. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Ramirez appeared, flashlight in hand, his voice firm. "Sergeant Miller, step away from the kennels." Miller turned, eyes flashing with panic. "You don't understand, kid. You don't know what I've done." Then tell me, Ramirez said, before this gets worse. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy silence of two men caught between duty and truth. Miller's hand trembled as he lowered the gun. His breath came in shuddering bursts. I didn't mean to kill him. I went to that house because I thought he had my watch. My father's watch. Things got out of control. Carter came running, shouting. I panicked. When it was over, I planted the wrench. I wrote the report myself. Ramirez stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in his grip. Then why keep quiet all these years? Miller's face twisted, eyes glistening. Because the system doesn't forgive. Because men like me don't get second chances. Before Ramirez could respond, Warden Wallace appeared with two more guards, their coats flapping as they entered. "Lower your weapons, Sergeant," he commanded. Miller sank to his knees, the gun falling into the snow at his feet. "I didn't want to die a liar," he whispered. By morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the prison cloaked in quiet frost. Miller sat in a holding room, hands cuffed, staring blankly at the floor. Outside the observation window, Samuel watched, his expression unreadable. He felt no triumph, only an aching relief. The man who had stolen his life had finally confessed. But in Miller's broken posture, Samuel saw not a monster, but another casualty of guilt and time. Later, in the yard, Ranger ran free for the first time since his arrival. His paws kicked up snow as he circled Samuel, barking joyfully. Ramirez stood nearby, smiling faintly. "He knew the truth before any of us did," he said. Samuel nodded. "He always did." He reached down to scratch behind Ranger's ear. "Sometimes it takes a dog to remind men what honesty looks like." That afternoon, Warden Wallace signed the final report. The charges against Samuel Carter were officially overturned. A statement was drafted for the media. Words that meant little compared to the years lost. But they were words of freedom all the same. As the sun dipped behind the frozen hills, the gates of Rockvale opened. Samuel stepped through them without shackles, the crisp air biting his cheeks. Ranger trotted beside him, tail wagging. Snowflakes sparkled in the fading light like pieces of a world renewed. Behind them, inside the gray fortress, Wallace watched from his window, his breath fogging the glass. "Maybe justice isn't blind," he murmured softly. "Maybe it just needed a guide." The sun rose weakly over Denver, filtered through the thin veil of mist that followed the storm. Snow still blanketed the city in quiet surrender, every rooftop and field softened under white. Along the narrow road leading out of Rockvale Penitentiary, a tall, silver-haired man walked with slow, deliberate steps, his breath turning to vapor in the morning chill. Beside him trotted a German shepherd, aged, noble, and alive with purpose. For the first time in years, Samuel Carter was not inmate number 1476. He was simply Samuel again. The world outside the walls felt almost unreal. Cars hummed distantly, a flock of crows scattered above the pines, and the air smelled faintly of pine sap and diesel. Samuel stopped for a moment by a frozen ditch, looking back at the prison, its gray towers receding into the white. "That's behind us now, boy," he murmured, his voice roughened by both age and disbelief. Ranger pressed his head against Samuel's thigh, his tail swaying gently. A state vehicle slowed beside them. Officer Ramirez leaned out the window, his face still young but shadowed by the sleepless exhaustion of recent nights.
"They told me you refused the bus ride into town," he said with a half smile. Samuel returned a faint grin. "After 7 years locked up, I'd rather feel the road under my feet." Ramirez got out, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "There's a small inn in Cedar Hollow, about 10 miles east. The warden arranged for you to stay there until your case file's fully cleared. It's quiet. Old woman runs it, sweet but sharp." "I'll manage," Samuel replied, but there was warmth in his tone. "You've done more than enough, son." Ramirez hesitated, his breath visible in the cold. "It wasn't just me. Wallace risked his position signing off on your release before the paperwork came through. And Detective Holden. She's been calling every hour, making sure you're free." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then tell them both. I owe them more than I can say." They parted ways there, Ramirez returning to the highway,
and Samuel continuing east, boots crunching through the half-frozen slush. Hours passed. The road wound through open farmland, the sky brightening to silver blue. Ranger trotted ahead, nose to the wind, his gait proud despite the stiffness in his joints. Every so often he'd stop, glance back, and bark softly as if to say, "Keep up, old man." By late afternoon, Samuel reached Cedar Hollow, a small mountain town tucked between snowy ridges. The streets were quiet and dotted with wood cabins and old pickup trucks. A bell above a storefront jingled as he entered Martha's Inn, a rustic lodge with creaking floors and the scent of firewood. Behind the counter stood Martha Hensley, a woman in her late 60s with iron-gray curls, warm brown skin, and eyes that carried the calm of someone who had seen much and judged little. She wore a faded wool sweater and an apron dusted with flour. "You must be Mr. Carter," she said kindly. "The warden called ahead. Room's ready upstairs. And the big fella there?" She nodded to Ranger, who sniffed the air politely. "He's welcome too, long as he doesn't chew the furniture." Samuel chuckled, his voice deep and soft. "He's better behaved than most people." "Then you'll fit right in." She handed him a brass key. "Supper's at 6. You look like you could use something warm." Upstairs, the room was simple. A single bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the snow-covered forest. Samuel sat by the window, watching the light fade behind the trees. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. Ranger curled at his feet, tail twitching as he drifted into sleep. As night fell, a knock came at the door. Samuel opened it to find Detective Sarah Holden, bundled in a long charcoal coat, her silver hair catching the lamplight. Her blue eyes, though lined with fatigue, still held the firmness of a woman who had lived by truth, even when it hurt. "Detective," Samuel said, surprised. "You came all the way out here?" "I needed to see it," she replied quietly. "To see you walk free." She stepped inside, removing her gloves. "I've replayed that night for years. I thought the system couldn't fail if we followed procedure. But it did, and I let it." Samuel shook his head. "You couldn't have known." Her voice trembled slightly. "I should have. Miller's guilt wasn't in the evidence. It was in his eyes. I ignored it because I wanted the case closed, not the truth found. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter." He studied her face, the regret etched deep into her expression. "I forgave you before you even asked," he said gently. "You gave me my life back." They stood in quiet understanding as the fire crackled downstairs. After a moment, Sarah smiled faintly. "You know, you're a stronger man than most would be after what you've endured." Samuel looked down at Ranger. "No, just a man who had the right company." The next morning, the snow began to melt, revealing patches of earth and the first hint of green. Samuel walked along the tree line with Ranger at his side. The wind smelled clean, alive. He thought about the years lost, about Margaret's laughter fading in memory, about nights he had prayed without hope. Life, he realized, wasn't about reclaiming the time stolen, but about honoring the time left. When they reached a rise overlooking the valley, Samuel stopped, resting a hand on Ranger's head. "We're going home," he whispered. He didn't know where home was anymore. Maybe a cabin by a lake, maybe a workshop where he could fix old engines again. But it would be somewhere the past couldn't follow. Back in town, Sarah watched them from her car before driving away, a faint smile softening her face. At the inn, Martha stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, murmuring, "The world still makes room for second chances." As the two figures disappeared into the distant white horizon, the snow began to fall again, not harshly, but softly, as if to bless their path. In the quiet snow of Colorado, Samuel Carter's freedom was more than a man's second chance. It was a miracle written in fur and faith. Sometimes God doesn't send angels in robes and light. He sends them with 4 paws, amber eyes, and a heart that never forgets. When the world turns its back, love still remembers. When justice fails, God's timing never does. Ranger didn't just find the truth. He became the vessel of grace, proof that even in our darkest winters, heaven still works through loyalty, kindness, and the creatures who love us without condition. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to whisper a prayer for second chances, for loyal hearts, for the silent miracles walking beside us every day. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may every act of love bring you closer to your own miracle. Before you go, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe that miracles still happen, type Amen in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and redemption. May God's grace walk with you, just as Ranger walked with Samuel, through every storm and every sunrise that follows.